if you're the Panthers, you just sit them the next 3 weeks, get the open date, and then you play them against Stroud to shut people up?
Yes.
Like me?
Yes.
I think that's the plan.
That's where we're at right now with the
Give them a
Carolina
month.
Panthers.
Just like, hey, man, I want to get you ramped up and ready to go. Maybe Corbett comes back by that time. Do we have a chance at Corbett? Austin Corbett coming back?
It's entirely
right, because that was a 4-game pup.
Yeah, it was he was on that injured reserve list kind of coming out of camp. That's the optimistic view. Totally get that.
But is that a bad plan?
I don't think it's a bad plan. It should be the plan, and good coaching sees what you might have had a plan going into the year.
Right.
And the plan going into the year was that Bryce Young starter week 1.
Take the good with the bad.
And we're going to just roll with it, and he's going to get up to speed. He's going to take the game experience.
Take them all, and there you have.
But there's enough evidence now based on the current state of the team itself, like what the on-the-field product, a bad offensive line, skill position players that are having a hard time separating and helping create offense, a running game that has ultimately been non-existent so far this season, and a lot of injuries mounting up, although you can look across the league and there's injuries everywhere. Somewhere Lamar Jackson's going, hi, do we want to talk about injuries? Not himself, but just the Ravens constantly find themselves.
I have carried the dead body of the Ravens for the last 4 years.
How much longer do you want me to do this, right? And Seattle, the team that just beat the Carolina Panthers, also was going through a whole list of injuries that they had to overcome, especially on the defensive side.
What a bizarro universe that Seattle's in, by the way.
I know.
Hey, we don't need Russ. We're going to go get Geno Smith.
And we still have
this,
working out just fine.
We still have Pete Carroll smacking his gum on the sideline.
That dude doesn't age, by the way.
And they're winning.
So now that you have this information, you're in a very delicate spot when it comes to Bryce Young and his development. I am of the mind that it's more important to develop Bryce Young to be the franchise quarterback you gave up a ton to get than to try to scrap together some
for this year. Yeah.
Than to scrap together some, we're going to try to still make the playoffs. You're not in a win now mode. You have to admit that you are rebuilding. You might have talked differently this offseason, but based on what we know now and based on what we've seen and based on what we know the Panthers need, let's not try to act as though Frank Reich's history with the Colts, where he started 1-5, finished 10-6, and won a playoff game, is somehow the path for the Carolina Panthers. No. The other reason why I think they should just go ahead.
Actually, Andy Dalton wasn't bad either.
But I mean, Andy Dalton was Andy Dalton. Okay. He wasn't spectacular, but I do find
saying on the scale of shitty quarterbacks we've seen fill in and play for the Panthers, like Andy Dalton is way closer to Derek Anderson than anything else that we've seen.
Andy Dalton at this point in his career is what you and I grew up with watching NFL football.
Yes.
Hey,
Steve DeBerg.
Here's a veteran who I know I can put him in and trust, which gets to the key word. It's pretty clear the Carolina Panthers do not trust Bryce Young to run this offense right now.
Well, I don't know if it's trust him or they don't want to damage him.
Here's Frank Reich yesterday. He was asked, I think it was Joe Person from The Athletic. He asked about, first 2 weeks of the season, you guys weren't really doing all that much. And yet you put Andy Dalton out there and suddenly you're taking a few more deep shots. The yard. What's going on here? And listen to Frank Reich, and this is why I say they don't trust Bryce Young.
No, I wouldn't say that was the case. I probably called a few more, because of I probably called a few more, and there were one or two things that Andy specifically asked for, which I wouldn't go into. I don't want to go into detail on, but there were a couple things that he specifically asked for, and then the one that we hit. The one that we hit the DJ for the touchdown, that was, obviously great execution by the offense, but also a good job by Thomas and Parks, Frazier, and the whole offensive staff. That was a play design that we saw something in the way they played their coverage that we thought we could expose something. And if we got in the right, and there was a certain situation, a certain time and place that we wanted to get it done, and it came up exactly how we wanted it to. And so that was a real credit to Thomas and Parks and the guys. Those were good things that we can build on.
So that's Frank Reich during yesterday's press availability. And I wanted to go back to that key part. He's like, well, there are some things that Andy wanted us to do. And those are some plays that I called and whatnot. Okay, well, where was this with Bryce Young? I get the preseason. I get that you want to ease him in. You don't want to show too much. Fine, whatever. We can do the yakety coach speak stuff. But when it's time to win football games and you're trying to get out there and do the thing, Well, why would you hold back unless you don't trust Bryce Young to be able to handle the guy who's you drafted this guy because of the processing ability. And now what you're saying is,
well, you drafted him, you had an idea for him. Now the question is, what is the best way to develop him?
If you and I can have an open conversation about how the Miami Dolphins handled Tua Tagovailoa to get to this point, if you and I can have an honest conversation about a future Hall of Famer in Patrick Mahomes,
I was going to say, Mahomes is the one you look at and go, what did they do with him? And I get it. Not everyone's that skilled. I get it.
Gets to
but he watched.
So here gets to my big question. What do you think Frank Reich wants to do versus what do you think David Tepper wants?
I think their plan was to use the number 1 overall pick on a franchise quarterback, let him learn on the job, and that you evaluated the right guy based on his intelligence, based on what you figured his skill set was. And I think the reality now they're looking at is, okay, now what do we do that's best for him in this investment? Because again, I'll repeat the same things I said about NC State that I'll say about the Panthers. I appreciate what they tried to do this offseason. I appreciate all of the moves they made in theory. In practice now, the question is, how do you make it work? And I think that's the biggest challenge facing them right now is the 2 biggest people who could help Bryce Young right now are Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore.
Yeah, well,
those are the 2 biggest people, and maybe Austin Corbett.
They need it, but the issue is that they needed to trade DJ Moore to get Bryce Young. Correct. That is the conundrum.
Correct.
Which again gets back to my central question. What do you think Frank Reich actually wants to do? Given the choice, do you think Frank Reich would rather start Andy Dalton the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I think so.
If Bryce Young is healthy, do you think he'd still rather start Andy Dalton?
Yeah, and I think part of this is the first 2 losses that they lost to division teams. Like if you take the schedule and flip it around, Chuck Amato, if you give up the 400 yards in the first half instead of the second half, nobody's talking about all the yards we give up in the second half.
Yeah.
If you lose to Atlanta, your division foes later, it gives you the sense that we could still win those games, win the division, and take care of our business. But by losing those games off the jump, I think it now put them in a situation to reevaluate and say, okay, we're not going to, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. And what is best for this investment? And I don't, if they would actually come out and say that,
the football people,
without neutering Bryce Young, by the way,
there, you have to handle that as well. Totally get that part. I think the football people get this, but I don't think David Tepper gets this. Again, I'm in pure speculation mode right now, but I can kind of go with what we've seen out of David Tepper since he's owned the Carolina Panthers.
Sure.
He would rather have the shiny object. He'd rather try to have butts in seats. He'd rather have the quick fix. And when he doesn't get what he wants, as with developments in Rock Hill and whatnot, he's ready to bail on these types of things. So he doesn't have the patience for that kind of stuff. And I bet you behind the scenes, there is a push and pull from what the owner wants and what football people want. And I think football people would have an honest assessment of where Bryce Young is now and look at other instances and say, look, if he is the guy, there's nothing wrong with having him develop.
Here's what's best. Here's what's best for him.
That's the most important part right now.
Maybe watching and learning while our offensive line is a fire drill right now.
I think that's a really simple conversation to have.